Up to now, we've been talking about the symmetries of crystals, which culminated in space group symmetry. But having fully covered that, we're now ready to move on to the next phase of this course, which is the diffraction of X-rays by crystals. We're going to start by considering the interaction of X-rays with first electrons and then atoms. So if we think about the interaction between electromagnetic radiation, specifically X-rays, and matter, here we're going to start with just a single electron, we can see that there's three different ways in which the two might interact. The X-rays can be scattered elastically by the electron. What do I mean by that? I mean that there's no change in the energy of the radiation, therefore no change in its wavelength. The X-rays might be scattered inelastically, so the electrons might absorb some of the energy of the X-ray, and in that case, the X-ray that is scattered has lost a little bit of energy, and therefore it has a slightly different wavelength. Or the X-rays can be absorbed. Now, in a real crystal, all three of these things happen, and in fact, the elastic and the inelastic scattering happen at about the same rate, and the absorption is actually much higher than the other two. However, only elastic scattering leads to diffraction. So for now, we're going to concentrate entirely on that and neglect the inelastic scattering and the absorption effects. What is the nature of the elastic scattering between electromagnetic radiation and the electron? Well, all electromagnetic radiation can be described as an oscillating electric and magnetic field, as we see in this schematic. Now, because the electron is a charged particle, it's going to respond to the electric field of the radiation. And that oscillating electric field is going to cause the electron to oscillate. And then fundamental properties of physics tell us that when we have a charged particle oscillating, the acceleration of a charged particle leads to the emission of more radiation. And that effect basically causes the electron to emit X-ray radiation in all directions. And importantly, the radiation that is emitted has the same frequency and therefore wavelength as the original electromagnetic wave. Now, I say that it emits radiation in all directions. Is it totally isotropic? Is the intensity of the emitted radiation the same in all directions? Well, not exactly. The intensity of the elastically scattered radiation is given by the equation here at the bottom. This is for an incoming X-ray beam that's polarized. That its electric field is polarized to be oscillating in the vertical direction in this figure. We see that there's two parts to the equation. The first part is just, we might call it a prefactor, the charge of the electron, the mass of the electron, the speed of light. Those are all fundamental constants. And then we see that at a point P, the intensity of the scattered radiation, it does drop off as 1 over the distance squared. That's all fine, but what's really important is the angular dependence, this sine squared chi term. From the properties of the sine term, we know that sine of 0 degrees is 0, and sine of 90 degrees is going to be 1. In the vertical direction, that is the direction in which the incoming X-ray beam is polarized, there is no scattering, right? The sine squared of 0 is still 0. But in all of the directions that are perpendicular to the direction of the polarization, that's 90 degrees for chi, then this sine squared term goes to 1, and that's going to be the maximum scattering. So what we end up getting is a distribution in the intensity of the scattered X-ray radiation that's donut-shaped. Now, what happens if the incoming X-rays are not polarized? For most lab X-ray sources, we make X-rays by bombarding a metallic target like copper or molybdenum with high-energy electrons from a filament. And that kind of radiation that's made in a lab X-ray tube is not polarized. the electric field of the radiation goes in all 360 degrees around the direction of propagation. And so when you have that situation, which is very common, the intensity of the scattered X-rays, we can get it by basically rotating this donut around the axis of propagation. And when we do that, we get this situation. So let's say we have a scattering plane in our crystal, we have incoming X-ray beam, and then the X-rays are scattered in a certain angle. We're going to call that angle 2 theta. And for those of you who have some familiarity with diffraction, you'll understand why we pick 2 theta as the variable. The intensity of the scattered radiation follows the equation given down here. The only thing we're really interested in is this last term in the parentheses, 1 plus cosine squared 2 theta. And that gives us the angular dependence of the scattered radiation. If the incident beam and the scattered beam are on the same path, right, that would be 2 theta equals 0, this term in parentheses would become 2. If, on the other hand, the 2 theta angle is 90 degrees, we're scattering at a 90-degree angle, that would be vertical in this picture, then the term in the parentheses becomes 1 plus 0. Cosine of 90 is 0. So then this term becomes a 1. So we see that at 2 theta equal 90, the intensity of the scattered radiation is only half of what it would be in the forward direction, or in the 2 theta equals 180, the backscattering direction. So if we come to this picture, which is the intensity in which the electromagnetic radiation is scattered from a point scatter, just a single electron here, we get what is basically a peanut-shaped distribution. Why is this important? We'll see that we have to make a correction for this effect, and that correction is called the polarization correction. Now, what about scattering from an atom, which is going to have multiple electrons? Well, before we talk about that, we have to talk about interference effects in waves. And in fact, this is really important for the next several lectures. So let's imagine that we have 2 electromagnetic waves, right? If this were a cosine function and we started at an angle of 0, the amplitude here is at a maximum. Cosine of 0 is 1. So we have a certain amplitude, and then all of this in the brackets here, if that went to 0, that would give us this point, right? So here is the position of the wave. This is the speed of light. This is the time that's passed, and this is the wavelength. So for a given wave, if we move along this x direction, we see that, the wave is going up and down. This is what a cosine function will do. And when we get to the quantity in the brackets here is 90 degrees, then the amplitude goes to 0. When it's 180 degrees, the amplitude goes to -1. At 270, it's going to be back to 0. And at 360, or 2 pi, in radians, the amplitude goes back to 1. And then we have this repeating function. If we have a second wave, and for whatever reason we started at a different point, let's say we start it right here, we're going to move that back to x equals 0. Okay, that would be like a phase shift delta of 90 degrees. It's kind of like we're starting not at 0 degrees, but at 90 degrees. So we have the same oscillating pattern, but we've just started from a different point on the wave. Now, if we were to take these 2 waves and add them together, which might happen if we had 2 waves and we phase shifted one by 90 degrees, then we're going to get this pattern. You can see right here at 0, this wave has an amplitude of 1, and this wave has an amplitude of 0. So when you add them together, you get an amplitude of 1. When you get to, let's say, 90 degrees, this one has gone to -1, and this one has gone to 0. So when you get there, then you're going to be down here at, -1. And so forth and so on. One important point of this is that the wavelength doesn't change. So because the 2 waves that are adding together have the same wavelength, the wavelength of the resulting wave is going to also have the same wavelength. Now what happens if we were to do a phase shift that was a little bit larger? let's say that we started not at a 90-degree phase shift, but we went all the way out here to 150 degrees. So we're going to take that point and move it back to 0. Okay? When we do that, here's where we start, and now this wave oscillates in the following manner. Now when we add these two together, we get a wave whose maximum amplitude is quite a bit smaller, right? Because in many places where wave 1 has a positive value, wave 2 has a negative value, and when you add them together, they mostly cancel. So the amplitude of this wave is much less than the amplitude of wave 1 and 2. Now, we might ask ourselves, what are the extremes in terms of interference effects? Well, the extreme, as you probably already know, is that when we shift the second wave by 180 degrees, that means we're starting at a trough, whereas the first wave is starting at a peak. And then when we add these two together, you see everywhere the troughs and peaks meet up, where this wave goes to 0, this wave goes to 0, and when you add these two waves together, they completely interfere destructively, and the net effect is 0. That's one extreme for a phase shift of 180 degrees. The other extreme would be a phase shift of 360 degrees, or 2 pi in radians. So if we shift all the way to this point and move it back to the origin, once again now we've got peaks lining up with peaks, troughs lining up with troughs, and when we add these together, the resulting wave looks like the other two, but the amplitude at the peak and the trough is twice that of the two waves that are added together. So in this way, we see how waves can interfere both constructively and destructively. What does this have to do with the scattering of X-rays by an atom? Well, if we were to take an atom that had 2 electrons, let's say a helium atom, now you have, let's say, wave 1 coming in, which is scattered by an electron here. Arbitrarily, we're going to put it at the nucleus, and then wave 2 coming in that's scattered by an electron that's out here. Coming in, these two waves are in phase. Their peaks line up, their troughs line up. But then, once we get to this point, wave 2 is scattered, and wave 1 keeps going. So this distance C to A is an extra distance that wave 1 travels. Now, after they're scattered, wave 2 being scattered earlier, it traverses from B to D before now it starts following the same path as wave 1. So the difference in the path length is CA minus BD. And that difference in path length is going to introduce a phase shift. And that phase shift is going to lead to some degree of destructive interference that was not there before the X-rays were scattered by these 2 electrons. Now, we could calculate the exact phase shift that occurs. We're not going to do that, but a key point to think about is it does depend on the angle of the scattering. Right? If they were scattered at a 2 theta angle of 0, then there would be no difference in path length, so there would be no destructive interference. And as theta gets larger, there is a bigger and bigger difference in path length and more destructive interference. We could calculate all that. We're not going to do that. But what we do take away from it is that the scattering of X-rays by an atom that might have many electrons is going to be a maximum for a 2 theta angle that's 0, and it's going to drop off as the 2 theta angle increases. So when you look at X-ray diffraction patterns, you'll always see that the diffraction peaks that come at low angles are more intense than those that come at high 2 theta angles. And a big part of that has to do with a drop-off in what we call the atomic form factor. So the atomic form factor for a given atom, actually there's quite a few terms in the function, I'm not going to give it all here, but it's going to be that function squared, this is the form factor, times by the intensity of scattering from a single electron. And here I've plotted the form factors of a few different atoms and ions. The x-axis here is sine theta divided by lambda, lambda being the wavelength of the radiation. Right? When theta is 0, then 2 theta is 0, and sine theta is 0. We see that oxygen has a form factor that's 8. It's because there are 8 electrons in an oxygen atom. Chlorine has a form factor that is 17, because there are 17 electrons in a chlorine atom. The chloride ion has a form factor of 18 because it has one more electron than a chlorine atom. And then if we were to look at potassium, cation, it also has 18 electrons, and so at sine theta equals 0, it has the same form factor as a chloride ion. But then as we move away to larger angles, then the form factors drop off. That's the most important thing to remember from this slide. And when we get to higher angles, let's say sine theta over lambda 0.6, that's getting out to maybe 140, 150 degrees on a copper X-ray source. Oxygen is now down to 2, right? So it's lost 75% of its scattering. The chloride ions and the chlorine atoms have all dropped off quite a bit as well. Second thing we can note from this slide is that even though chloride and potassium ion have the same number of electrons, the chloride form factor drops off more rapidly than the potassium ion form factor. And the reason for that is because anions are larger than isoelectronic cations. And the larger the ion, the more interference effects and the faster this drops off. You might also be wondering, well, when I do a diffraction experiment for an ionic compound, like potassium chloride, should I use the form factor for chloride or for chlorine? Because they're a little bit different. And, we could get into a debate about that, but if you do start thinking down that line, you should realize that the differences between the two are most pronounced at low angles. And after you get out to moderate to high angles, they actually converge to be essentially the same. So we can put this all together and we can come back to our atom and we can say, if we have an incident X-ray beam coming in, then the intensity distribution of the elastically scattered X-rays is going to look something like this. So the biggest scattering is going to be in the forward direction, 2 theta scattering angle equals 0, because in that case the polarization is at a maximum and there's no interference effects from scattering from multiple electrons in the atom. And then when we combine both the polarization, which is shown here, and the form factor drop-off with angle that I talked about on the previous couple of slides, we can see that we get something that gets smaller and smaller as we go to larger and larger scattering angles.